Let's just take a moment and appreciate that we live in a timeline where Doom has once again regained its status as one of the most popular shooters of its era. Despite what almost any market analyst or major publisher until recently would tell you, this outdated style of game design has not only found an audience, but a huge one. With a new retro-style shooter getting announced and released every other month, it's strange to think only a few years ago, the idea of these games, now referred to by some as boomer shooters, ever regaining an audience was considered nonsense. Yet, we live at a time where 3D Realms, the company behind the classic Duke Nukem, is not only publishing games again, but has even started a yearly expo dedicated to this growing subgenre. How did this once beloved genre die? And more importantly, how did it manage to come back from the dead? For that story of necromancy, we need to start at the beginning. As you all likely know, following the relatively small success of the shooter Wolfenstein 3D, id released the series that made the first-person shooter a mainstream genre with Doom. For some time after, pretty much all FPS were known as Doom clones. With a few notable exceptions, if you thought of a first-person shooter during the mid-90s, you likely thought of something that either was or played quite closely to the original Doom games. It's a bit difficult to really define this subgenre and what should and shouldn't be considered a Doom clone, but I think there are features that nearly all FPS of this time share. Someone did the math. Apparently Doom Guy runs at over 50 miles an hour, but this level of speed isn't just exclusive to him. Speed is a crucial part of any boomer shooter. You'll need that speed because not only is your character fast, but so is the pacing. Monsters, cultists, demons, aliens, there'll be a lot of them, and they'll rarely if ever give you a break. Unlike shooters that came after, fast-paced action and hordes of relentless enemies are a core part of what separates these games from their contemporaries. This one's quite subjective, but when you play games like Doom, Duke, etc., can't help but feel a certain metal screw you 90s attitude.
You're gonna have to do better than that, you bald-headed bitch!
It encapsulates everything that the media hated about video games. Were video games satanic in the 90s? Not sure, but these games definitely were trying to be. Of course, my list is something I predict many will disagree with. There are other aspects of the genre that were very common. For example, maps being very complex and intricate, allowing players to find hidden rewards. There are also things these shooters tended to not have. For example, they were never bogged down by things like long cutscenes. It's important to keep these things in mind when trying to figure out how the medium eventually abandoned this genre. And abandoned it, it did. In my opinion, there are two games that can truly be credited with starting the decline of the Doom clone fad, and the first of these is HalfLife. The first HalfLife at a glance seems to share more with Doom clones of the past than modern games. After all, it's a fast-paced shooter, one that had a map design filled with hidden rewards for the player to find. But Half-Life marks a turning point in the genre. While everyone will tell you about how Half-Life was revolutionary for its not cutscenes, cinematics and set pieces that would play around the player, what really helped set Half-Life apart was that it didn't just focus on intense action, but instead the series' strength came from how much focus the developers put on pacing. See, in Doom clones, you're pretty much always put into a map with a large number of enemies being thrown at you. You couldn't go a few feet without having a few dozen aliens or demons breathing down your neck. While the action itself was generally quite fun, these games did little to increase player variety. From the start to the end of the game, the player is dealing with a level 11 on a 10-point scale of intensity. Half-Life was a bit more reserved. Yes, it was inspired by games like Doom, but it also took a cue from the recently popularized survival horror genre. Half-Life got into the player's head, giving the player both more intense and less intense moments. Straight action sometimes, broken up by survival horror or puzzle-solving elements. And each enemy encounter was designed in a way to feel unique. While previous shooters like Unreal tried to do something similar, it was Half-Life that really mastered the type of pacing. So while there were exceptions like the later released Painkiller or Serious Sam, most PC shooters stopped wanting to be Doom and instead started wanting to be Half-Life. On the console front, things were changing as well. While a few successful shooters like GoldenEye showed that FPS on a console can be successful, it took one game to really lay down the blueprints of what the next decade and a half of FPS were going to look like: Halo. Halo is built from the ground up to handle the limitations of a controller. Despite what some random children on internet forums think, a controller is not as accurate as a mouse and keyboard. You can't control your aiming speed nearly as well, nor can you be as precise with what a controller gives you. Halo, intelligently deciding to use the dual sticks, one for movement and one for aiming, decided that making a shooter accessible was their first and most important priority. First, because aiming with the controller was slower, they lowered the player character's speed and gave him regenerating shields. The regenerating shields were important because it meant that as a player, you can take some damage while waiting to aim at the correct enemy without facing a permanent health loss. Halo also lowered the amount of guns you can hold to 2. This means switching from one gun to another only required a single press of a button. Having grenades and melee be their own separate buttons was also important because it meant controller players could always use these without having to fumble between weapons, which would be quite difficult without a mouse wheel or keyboard numbers. Now add intelligent AI, good level design, and a gripping story, and it's no wonder why Halo was able to single-handedly make the Xbox a household brand. Sadly, while both Half-Life and Halo were great in their own right, the only things publishers and developers wanted to take from these two games were their elementary pieces. Instead of Half-Life's amazing pacing and encounters, developers decided that long, unskippable semi-cutscenes and expensive set pieces were the way to go in some strange way of trying to emulate movies. For Halo, rather than realizing the importance of good AI and level design, they decided that accessibility should be the only thing that matters, and if it hurt the actual merit of the game design, so be it. Accessibility and trying to be a movie led to what I consider the worst time in the history of FPS. Suddenly, console shooters were all anyone wanted to make. Series like Call of Duty would have story modes that were pretty to look at, but due to its over-reliance on accessibility, would be quite shallow. Other mechanics designed to slow down gameplay, such as cover, fully regenerating health, or sprint features that allow you to go fast but at the cost of not being able to turn, jump, or shoot, would become default in the vast majority of new FPS released. Due to this, their multiplayers would be slow and rely more on positioning than map control, dodging, or actual aiming skill. This led to strategies such as camping to dominate online matches. During this time, PC gaming was on the decline. During the later half of the 2000s, it was believed that PC gaming was simply dead or on its way out. Considering PC gaming now makes more money than all console gaming combined, this might sound silly, but for a time it really did look that way. Even Doom had to adapt to these changes. When Doom 3 released in 2004, it was far closer to a survival horror than a traditional 90s shooter, mimicking what Half-Life did before. It also had a release on Xbox, and due to its slower nature, translated well to the console. While Doom 3 had its own strengths as a horror game, it was really only Doom in name. In 2008, it was officially announced that it would be developing a Doom 4. Fans like me hoped that it would go back to the basics and maybe bring about the rise of these classic shooters. A far-fetched dream, but you have to understand how desperate we were back then. We had no idea how bad things could have become. Which, in retrospect, might have been foolish for me to have that hope. Even the once mighty Halo had to bow down to the monster it helped create. With Reach and later Halo games adding features like sprint, perks, and a higher emphasis on aiming down sights in order to try to appeal to the COD audience. And Doom 4, at first, was no different. Doom 4 was, in all intents and purposes, a COD clone. It saw the trend and wanted to follow it. Leaked footage shows off the Doom we may have gotten. Generic military men in generic military gear doing generic military things, but with a Doomish skin put on the enemies and backgrounds. Insiders say that this game would be heavily scripted and cinematic. The granddaddy of FPS turned into a pale imitation of another game. Thankfully, a few people at id thought so too, as this version of Doom was cancelled due to the game's lack of personality. In the meantime, things in the game industry were changing. While physical PC sales continued to drop year over year, digital sales would consistently increase. As PC gaming continued to innovate and give players things console gaming simply couldn't, As well as giving players amazing gaming deals thanks to their now mostly digital distribution method and competition through multiple marketplaces, people started to realize that PC gaming was becoming a good long-term gaming investment. Not only that, but with websites like Twitch releasing in 2011, streamers were able to capture a new generation of gamers. Since streaming is so much easier on PC, young people started being constantly bombarded with what can be seen as advertisement for the PC platform, since all of their favorite streamers were playing, most likely, on PC. With people finally starting to get sick of the hundreds of COD clones on the market, and as PC gaming started growing again, all it took was the right game to show modern gamers how fun a fast and classic style shooter could be.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Doom.
While the game received a lot of criticism when it was first announced, for example, most of the gameplay shown was deliberately slow in order to show off the graphics and enemy designs, once it finally released, people were actually able to see how it played, and a new generation was introduced to the boomer shooter. Doom 2016 isn't an exact clone of the original two games. It feels like what an evolution of the genre might have been like if Halo, Half-Life, or COD never existed. Like the original, the game didn't have reloading. Instead, you would switch between different weapon mods on the fly, which would act as an alternative fire mode. Unlike the original Doom, you could now jump, and much of the game involved platforming, despite platforming in FPS being considered a taboo at the time. Doom 2016 was able to do some of the things the original Half-Life accomplished. While the game was fast and brutal, it used these platforming segments mentioned earlier, so you weren't just fighting enemies non-stop. Also, like Halo, it was able to make a few concessions that would allow the game to be easier for console players, but rather than limiting your weapons or forcing you to go slow, the console version of Doom added a slow motion weapon wheel. This allowed players to switch weapons, even on a controller. Also, by embracing speed, id didn't have to give players regenerating health. Instead, you as the player can dodge enemy fire long enough to kill enemies, even with your controller's slower aiming time. This isn't to say the game was perfect. I personally found having two melee characters to get health back to hurt the game's flow, and other players complained that the number of enemies on screen at a time were lower than the original games. But despite these issues, the game was an amazing success, giving most older FPS fans something that appeals to them while giving newer and console FPS players an experience like something they never had before. Doom was able to evolve itself without needlessly copying its competition, which made it a huge blockbuster success. Thus began the boomer shooter renaissance, a time we're still currently living in. Doom Eternal, Ion Fury, Dusk, Serious Sam 4, upcoming games like Hellsinger, Graven, Wraith, A New Painkiller, and much more show that this genre is alive and healthy. Even Halo Infinite seems to have taken a few notes from the recent Doom games. And I don't mean that they copied any specific gameplay elements, more of the philosophy that, hey, you don't have to be COD to make a profit. If there's one thing to be learned from all this, it's that we live in a time where any genre can be brought back from the dead if done right. Serving an underserved market is often the better choice compared to just following the trend. While these boomer shooters now only make up a portion of the shooter market, rather than dominating it full stop like they once did, I'm pretty sure most fans are okay with this. No one wants to go back to the days when something like the original Doom or Call of Duty completely dominated the market. The modern gaming industry is big enough to hold more than one type of shooter. In the end, let this be a lesson. When no one wants to make something because it's considered outdated, maybe it's only considered so because no one bothered making it again. Until next time, see ya.